The title of the chapter, Patterns of Social Inequality and Exclusion. Now, before we delve into this chapter, let's just recap. A society consists of social institutions. What are they? Well, family, caste, tribe, etc. are the social institutions. And these social institutions help in the formation of communities and they also sustain the society. When we find that these communities are not at an equal footing with each other, then we say that social inequality exists. In what ways? Well, these communities have unequal access to social resources. Why are we using the term social with social inequality? Well, because first of all, when we're talking about inequalities, they are social because number one, they are about groups. Secondly, they are economic. And third, they are systematic and structured. Now, the next question arises, what are social resources? Well, social resources includes money, property, education, health, power. All these are categorized as social resources. According to the thinker Bourdieu, we have three forms of capital. Number one is the economic, number two, the cultural, and number three, social. When we say economic capital, we are talking about material assets and income. When we're talking about the cultural capital, we're talking about educational qualifications and status. And third, when we're talking about social capital, we're talking about the network of contacts and social associations. Now remember, these three forms of capital are overlapping with each other and they can be converted into one another. When we're talking about social inequality, remember, note that social inequality is not about innate or natural difference, but arising due to social stratification. So, social stratification causes people to be ranked in a hierarchy, and because they are ranked in a hierarchy, their experiences, their identity are shaped because of this, and also their relationship with one another. And not only that, this also affects their access to resources and opportunities. Therefore, you can see that social stratification results in the unequal access to resources and the unequal opportunities for people and gives rise to social inequality. So, we've understood that this social stratification is a characteristic of society, it's not due to individual differences. Secondly, this persists over generation, that is, this is something that is passed on from one generation to another. The interesting thing to note is that this stratification is supported by patterns of belief or ideology. For example, in the caste system, a person's social position is ascribed, and birth dictates that person's occupational activity. The ascribed aspect of social inequality then gets further reinforced by the practice of endogamy or marriage within the caste. The net result is that this system perpetuates discrimination and exclusion. Now, this discrimination and exclusion could be because of, apart from caste, due to gender, religion, ethnicity, language, or disability. Note that it is very hard to prove discrimination as it is not openly stated, but you can see that discrimination manifests itself in the form of different treatment for different categories of people. The net result is that the person who is feeling discriminated feels that it might be because of certain prejudice or preconceived opinions or attitudes, and these are formed without any available evidence. So, the thing to understand is that these opinions about the people are grounded in stereotypes. What is a stereotype? Well, it is a fixed notion of a group and it does not have any basis. So, this results in the whole group of people being considered as a homogeneous unit. Now, note this can be both positive or negative. When we talk about something negative, say for example, women are bad drivers, or the stereotyping of certain communities as martial races and the others as cowardly. Now, one important thing to remember is that the prejudice describes attitudes and opinions, while discrimination refers to actual behavior. Now, let's move on to the next concept, that is social exclusion. What is social exclusion? Well, it refers to ways in which the individual may become cut off from the full involvement in the wider society. Remember, exclusion is involuntary, that is, it is practiced against the wishes of the person who is excluded. Also, note that it is systematic. How? Because it is due to the structural features of the society that is in denying the groups the opportunities that are available to other people. So now let's look at caste. And caste is a system that justifies and perpetuates inequality. Historically, the caste system classified people according to their occupation and status. According to the ancient scriptures, social and economic status was supposed to be sharply separated. However, in practice, high caste people were having high economic status. In modern time, though, the link between caste and economic status is less rigid, and also people can change their occupation. We find that every caste has rich and poor people. So, one of the discriminatory practices of the caste system was the system of untouchability. So, what is untouchability? It is the avoidance, or you could say the prohibition of physical contact with a person of a lower caste. And this is a pan Indian phenomenon, that means it is found all over India. Untouchability is an extreme and vicious aspect of the caste system. In fact, the untouchables were considered to be outside the caste hierarchy. Now, there are three dimensions to untouchability. One is exclusion, two is humiliation, subordination, and three is exploitation. Let me go one by one over them. When we use the word exclusion, that means these untouchables were prevented from sharing water, they were not allowed to enter places of religious worship. When we're talking about humiliation, we're talking about ways to subordinate them. That is, the untouchables were forced to carry their shoes in their hands and take off their headgear or the pugri. And last, the dimension of untouchability that we are going to discuss is exploitation. That is, the untouchables were forced to take up unpaid labor. That is, they were not paid for their work and they were denied the ownership of property. Whatever property they had was taken away or confiscated from them. The untouchables were called Harijans or Dalits. Harijan is translated as children of God and Dalits as the downtrodden. So it's not just the caste system like in India that causes the society to be stratified. There is also apartheid that perpetuates inequality. Apartheid existed in South Africa and it was something that was used by the European white minority to gain political control over South Africa. Apartheid means the separation of the races on the basis of skin color. And the sad part is that the South Africans face this kind of discrimination within their own country. They were denied citizenship rights, they were forcibly relocated to Bantustans or homelands, that is, those districts that had no infrastructure, and these were poor districts. The rich white minority of South Africa defended their privileges. The black South Africans were viewed as social inferiors by the whites. They used military repression in order to maintain their power. Finally, in 1994, under the direction of Nelson Mandela, the African National Congress came into power and was able to end the system of apartheid. So, in present time, although the Constitution of Africa has banned racial discrimination, we find that the economic capital still remains concentrated in the hands of the European minorities. So, now let's look at the various state and non state initiatives that are addressing the caste and tribe discrimination problem. Well, first of all, Article 17 of the Indian Constitution has banned untouchability, and the practice of untouchability in any form is forbidden. In 1989, the Government of India enacted the Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes Prevention of Atrocities Act, which recognized various kinds of acts of violence and discrimination against the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes as a punishable offense. We also have the Prohibition of Employment as Manual Scavengers and the Rehabilitation Act 2013, whereby this legislation places a strong emphasis on restoring the rights and human dignity of the manual scavengers. That is, the untouchables in the past were forced to take up this kind of occupation as it was considered polluting, and it was a menial job. The other important current legislations in the institution regarding this discrimination are Article 14, that ensures equality before the law, Article 15, which prohibits discrimination, that is, no citizen may be subjected to discrimination by the state solely based on their religion, race, caste, sex, or place of birth. Also, Article 16, which offers equality of opportunity, that is, no citizen should be disqualified from holding any position under the state solely based on religion, race, caste, sex, descent, or place of birth. Also, another important article is Article 46. The article mandates that the state shall promote with particular care the educational and economic interests of the weaker sections of the people, and in particular of the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribes, and shall protect them from social injustice and all forms of exploitation. Also, Article 330 and 332 provides for seat reservation in the House of the People and the state legislative assemblies for members of the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Not only that, there is also provision of reservation in the local bodies, that is, the panchayats and the municipalities. The non-state initiatives have been the social movements that were promoted by the reformers like Mr. Ambedkar and Mr. Gandhi. Also, the voluntary organizations Harijan Sevak Sangh is also an attempt in promoting the interests of the scheduled caste people. Thus, these are some of the measures that have been implemented to improve the condition of these socially and economically marginalized people. The vision is of giving them the freedom to exercise their right and lead a regular life. The people are the wealth of the nation, and for nation building, it is important to look after the welfare of the people, irrespective of whichever caste, gender, religion, race, creed they belong to. Now let's look at the OBCs, the other backward class. That is, it is a collective term that was used by the Government of India to classify castes that were educationally or socially backward. A commission for OBCs was set up, the first one by Kaka Kalekar in 1953 and the second one by B.P. Mandal in the year 1990. The OBCs are the castes that fall between the three higher varnas and the Dalits. Roughly half of the population falls under the OBC category. The OBCs are socially and economically disadvantaged. The OBCs are a diverse group and they are found in all major Indian religions. In order to address the historical disadvantage, the social discrimination, and the lack of representation, the government had designed certain reservation schemes for these members of the backward class. The benefits include special seats in the Legislative Assembly and government services. The objective of making the Indian society a democratic and egalitarian society suffered a setback when the politicization of OBC for political power gaining began to take place. There is a large disparity between the upper and lower OBCs who are very poor and disadvantaged, and they are not very different from the Dalits in the socio-economic terms, and this makes it a difficult political category to work with. The upper OBCs are largely landed castes and enjoy dominance in the rural society, and thus the reservations in education and public employment could not adequately handle this large disparity between the upper and lower OBCs. Now let's look at the Adivasi struggles. The Adivasis or the Jana or tribes were believed to be the people of the forest. They were the original inhabitants of the subcontinent, and their distinctive habitat, that is the hills and the forest, shaped their economic, social and political attributes. One thing to note is that they were not totally cut off from the mainstream Hindu society. In fact, they have had long and close association with the society and culture of the Hindus, and as such, the boundary between them was not so rigid. Remember that there is no area exclusively inhabited by the tribals of India, except, say, for the northeastern states, where there is a higher area of tribal population concentration. The struggle of the Adivasis is against the outsiders, whom they call Dikos, and secondly against the state. To get a better understanding, let's look at their condition before independence. Before independence, they were displaced by the British colonial government, and their forested areas were taken over by the government for their own use. The Adivasis were denied access to forests, and they were prosecuted as encroachers if they were found to enter the forest illegally. Remember, the Adivasis did not have any concept of ownership of land, and this seemed to be a problem as after independence, again the Adivasis were displaced, this time in the name of development. Their forest and their habitat was acquired for building dams and for mining purposes. Their forests were exploited for natural resources, and the Adivasis were made to vacate the land without any appropriate compensation or without any proper rehabilitation setup. And this was done on the justification of national development and economic growth. Projects such as the Sardar Sarovar Dam on the river Narmada and the Polavaram Dam on the river Godavari in Andhra Pradesh displaced thousands of Adivasis, driving them to greater destitution or poverty. The economic liberalization of 1990s made the problem more acute because now it became easier for corporate firms to acquire large areas of land by displacing Adivasis. Like the term Dalit, the term Adivasis connotes political awareness and the assertion of rights. The term Adivasis was coined in the 1930s as part of the struggle against the intrusion by the colonial government and outside settlers and money lenders. The Adivasis have been waging a struggle against their marginalization, which has pushed them into poverty and dependence and forced them to search for other forest land for food and shelter. Note that the Constitution of India has recognized the Adivasi community in India under Schedule 5 of the Constitution. Hence, the tribes recognized by the Constitution are known as scheduled tribes. The tribal movement has resulted in significant achievement for them. One is the attainment of statehood for Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, which were originally part of Bihar and Madhya Pradesh, respectively. One step in the right direction has been the Forest Rights Act of 2006, although it is still in need of refinement for it to be beneficial to the Adivasis. Note that as per the 2011 census, Adivasis constitute 8.6% of the population, and according to Article 342 of the Constitution of India, there are over 700 scheduled tribes. The Adivasi struggle is restricted to a certain extent due to the high illiteracy rate amongst the tribals. Now let's look at the struggle for women's equality and rights. The biological and physical differences between men and women has resulted in gender inequality being treated as natural. Thus, through centuries, women have been placed in a subordinate position and have been denied access to social resources. Scholars have found that gender inequality is not because of biological reasons but is a social construct. Both male and female social reformers have been actively campaigning for equal rights for women. We have Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who created the Brahmo Samaj, and he is associated with the anti-Sati movement. Also, we have Jyotiba Phule, who fought against caste and gender oppression, and M.G. Ranade, who took up the issue of widow remarriage. These social reformers belonged to the 19th century and they were inspired by the democratic ideals of the West and also the democratic tradition of India's past. Jyotiba Phule, who belonged to the socially excluded caste, and Raja Ram Mohan Roy and M.G. Ranade, who belonged to the upper and middle class respectively, were all campaigners for women's equal rights. We also have Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, who campaigned for social reform movements in Islam. Women were also active in the struggle against women's inequality. We have books written by women that are looking at the idea of women's equality. Stree Purush Tulna was written by Tarabai Shinde and it was a protest against the double standards of a male-dominated society. Sultana's Dream, written by Begum Rokeya Shakawat Hussain, was a book in which the gender roles were reversed. Apart from these two feminists, there were a large number of women's organizations that arose both at the all India and local levels in the earlier 20th century. This can be called as the first phase, that is, beginning in the mid 19th century when the reformists began to speak in favor of women's rights by advocating reforms in education and the customs involving women. Now, the second phase of women's movement can be taken from the year 1915 to India's independence, when Gandhiji incorporated women's movement into the Quit India movement and independent women's organizations began to emerge. In 1931, the Karachi session of the Indian National Congress committed itself to women's equality. The third phase of the women's movement, that is after independence, focused on modern issues such as those related to treatment of women at home after marriage. In the 1970s, we have an emphasis on modern issues like the representation of women in popular media, the gendered consequences of unequal development, and dowry murders, etc. Post 1980 onwards, there has been a realization that many laws of concern to women have not changed since the 19th century. The realization that this is going to be a long struggle is shown by the fact that there is still a declining sex ratio, which shows that there is a strong social bias against the girl child. Now let's move on to the struggles of the disabled. Their struggle is something that has come into the forefront in the recent years. Now let's look at what do you mean by disabled. Well, disabled are differently able. That is, the society operates in such a manner that it does not cater to their needs and treats them as physically or mentally impaired. The public perception of disability all over the world is that it is a biological given. Secondly, that it has been taken for granted that the problems originate because of the disabled person's impairment. The disabled person is seen as a victim, and the disability is supposed to be linked with the disabled individual's self perception. The very idea of disability suggests that they are in need of help. Handicapped, blind, deaf, crippled are labels that are often used as insults by people. Why, you might think? Because our culture values a perfect body and everything else as distortions. So, disabled people are looked at as victims and they are having that condition because of their bad karma. And hence, disability is essentially individual. And destiny has a hand in it. Also, the popular images in mythology portray the disabled in an extremely negative fashion. With an increased awareness, it has been found that the disabled are rendered disabled not because they are biologically disabled, but because the society renders them so. A variety of societal barriers contribute to the several challenges faced by the disabled, like limited accessibility, inadequate educational structures, and poverty. This negatively impacts their quality of life and often leads to social exclusion, negative stereotypes and perceptions, and also mental health issues. Efforts to redress the situation have come from the disabled themselves, and the government has responded. Now, it is only recently that the disabled themselves have understood that there is a need for building an awareness in the society and to rethink what disability is. This heightened awareness of the need to rectify their condition has enabled the disabled to struggle for their rights. Thus, in this chapter, we see that institutions perpetuate inequalities and exclusion, and it is through the struggles against these inequalities that has paved the way for a better society. And with this, we conclude this chapter.